Hi, and welcome to this episode of Tackling Your Taxes When and While to File a Tax Return. My name is Aisha Servati, and I'm the director of Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid's Low Income Taxpayer Clinic. So on this episode, Tackling Your Taxes, we're going to be talking about when are you required to file a tax return, when it's advantageous to file a tax return, talking about the IRS Interactive Tax Assistant to assist you in determining whether to file a federal tax return. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the tax clinic and some helpful resources. So when is someone required to file a tax return? Everyone who earns money or lives in the United States is subject to the tax laws and must file necessary tax returns. And that's for both residents and non-residents of the United States. And so, in order to file a tax return, you either need a social security number or what's called an individual taxpayer identification number, or ITIN. You need that for both yourself and then any dependents that you're claiming. Just to note that taxes are due by April 15, 2024 for filing tax year ending December 31st, 2023. So looking a little bit more at when you're required to file a tax return. If you have a gross income that is at least one of these levels, depending on your filing status, then you do have a tax filing obligation. You can also have a tax filing obligation outside of this. But first, looking at if you're a single filing status taxpayer who's under 65, then you must file a return if your gross income was at least $13,850. And that's these numbers are for the IRS for filing a federal return. They're similar for the state of Minnesota. If you're looking at filing a state of Minnesota return, they're just slightly less than the federal numbers. But what you're looking at is what is technically the standard deduction on a tax return. So if you're making at least what the standard deduction is, then you must file a tax return. There are certain situations, like if you're self-employed, then regardless of your age, if you make $400 or more, then you must file a tax return and make estimated tax payments throughout the tax year. One thing to also note is if you receive Social Security benefits, the rules are slightly different. If you do single filing status and make at least, if you make up to $25,000, then you don't need to file a tax return. If you do married filing jointly, then it's $32,000. So when is it advantageous to file a tax return? So there are times when you might not have a filing obligation because you make less than that standard deduction amount, but it can still be helpful to file a tax return. So if you have any income tax withheld from your pay, you can look at getting that back through a tax refund. Same if you make estimated tax payments if you're self-employed and your tax liability ends up being less than the amount of taxes withheld or estimated payments that you made. One thing to also note is if you qualify for certain tax credits, which we'll be talking about more about different tax credits in future Tackling Your Taxes series. But I just want to highlight the Minnesota Child Tax Credit. That is a new tax credit that you don't need any income for. So you can receive public benefits and still qualify for the Minnesota Child Tax Credit. And so that amount is up to $1,750 per child with no limit on the number of children. And you can have a social security number or an ITIN and qualify for that. So the rules are a little bit different than the federal child tax credit. So more families are eligible for the credit and they're encouraged to file a Minnesota tax return in order to claim that credit. So there's both the Minnesota tax credit, there's a federal child tax credit, there's a Minnesota working family credit and the federal earned income tax credit. There's also other dependent credits like the child and dependent care credit and the credit for other dependents and the credit for older children in Minnesota, which is new as well. Then there's also federal and Minnesota education credits that can be helpful for increasing a refund or getting a refund. And another thing that we'll be talking about in a future Tackling Your Taxes series is if you qualify for the economic impact payments or the stimulus payments, and you did not file a return or receive your payment in 2020 or 2021, the only way to get those stimulus payments now is as the recovery rebate credit and to file a tax return. So you'd want to file a 2020 tax return for payments 1 and 2 and a 2021 return for payment 3 if you did not receive those. If you rent or own a home in Minnesota, it can be helpful to file for your renter's rebate credit and homestead property tax refund. And if you're applying for U.S. citizenship, one of the requirements is that you be current on any filing obligations that you have to show good moral character. Some additional reasons why it's advantageous to file a tax return. Like I mentioned before, it can get you some money back if taxes are withheld from your paycheck and you're owed a refund, or for those refundable tax credits like the Minnesota Child and Working Family Credit tax credits. You can avoid interest and penalties by filing an accurate return on time and paying any amount owed by the deadline of April 15th. And even if you can't pay, you still want to be able to file on time or request an extension to avoid penalties and certain fees. If you're applying for financial aid for yourself or a student, you need to provide tax account information from either the student's own tax return or the parent's tax return. In order to build your Social Security benefits, it's based on the income that's reported to the IRS and Social Security Administration. So you want to have accurate records for what you're submitting on your tax return. And then just in general, to get an accurate picture of your income, you want to make sure that you're reporting all of your income. So it can give an idea to lenders about the amounts of a loan that you're eligible for and certain rates that you're entitled to receive. And so I want to also talk about some help that's available on the IRS website to determine if you should file a federal tax return. There's the IRS Interactive Tax Assistant at www.irs.gov/help/ITA/do I need to file a tax return. And for that tool, it takes about 12 minutes or so to complete. You need to know what your filing status is going to be, what your gross income is, and then any additional information like if you're eligible to claim certain dependents or other credits or deductions. Just having a general picture of what your tax returns would look like will be helpful in determining whether or not you should file a tax return. So lastly, I'm going to be talking about the Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid's Low-Income Taxpayer Clinic and some helpful resources. So at the Tax Clinic, we advocate for, advise, and educate low-income and English as a second language taxpayers across the state of Minnesota. So we are statewide, not just based in the Twin Cities and representing only those who live in the area. It's for the entire state of Minnesota. And we can represent Minnesota taxpayers whose income does not exceed 250% of the federal poverty guidelines. So for example, a two-person household would be $4,258 a month gross income or $51,100. And then we can offer advice to anyone regardless of income. So if you don't qualify for representation services because you're just above that amount, then we can still offer you advice and guidance in being able to help you find the right solution to your tax problem. And when we're assisting people, we're assisting Minnesota taxpayers with things like U.S. tax court representation. The U.S. tax court is coming to St. Paul on May 20th, 2024. So if you're involved in a U.S. tax court case or receive a notice of deficiency from the IRS, that's something that we can assist with. We can help with tax settlements and payment plan agreements, preventing or stopping garnishments because of financial hardship, and disputing tax audits. And we'll have future Tackling Your Taxes episodes on on things like payment plans, preventing garnishment, and disputing audits. And we have previous episode from last year all about the US tax court. So if you are interested in learning more about that, look in our archives on our Facebook live posts and you'll be able to find that episode. So lastly, just some resources to assist you. If you do have any tax questions, if you receive a notice from the IRS, if you have questions about whether or not you can claim someone as a dependent or whether or not you should file a tax return, you can contact us with your tax issues and questions. You can call Mid-Minnesota Legal Aid intake at 612-334-5970. One thing I always note is that we do not prepare tax returns at the LITC. If you do need help with that, you can visit irs.gov/VITA in order to find a volunteer income tax assistance site in the area. You can also go to the Minnesota Department of Revenue's website at revenue.state.mn.us and search free tax preparation. And you can search over 200 sites located throughout the state. You can do it based on distance from you, on your zip code or county or preferred language. And lastly, for more legal resources, you can go to lawhelpmn.org. There are fact sheets for different tax issues as well as other legal issues. So that can be a helpful resource for finding out more legal information and to find a clinic or legal aid organization or other organization that would be able to help you. So thank you for tuning in for this episode of Tackling Your Taxes series, and we'll be back in 2 weeks with our next topic. Have a great day.